The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 4B in the Los Angeles County Superior Court, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Rebecca Stone adjusted her reading glasses and surveyed the packed gallery. With the practiced eye of someone who had presided over thousands of cases during her distinguished 25-year career, today felt different, though she couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the unusual media attention for what should have been a routine armed robbery trial, or maybe it was the palpable tension radiating from the prosecution table or district. Attorney David Hayes sat with his most experienced team. Emma Martinez fidgeted in the hard wooden chair outside the courtroom, her small hands clutching a worn teddy bear that had been her constant companion since entering the foster care system 2 years ago. At 7 years old, she had already seen more trauma than most adults could imagine, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Her foster mother, Maria Santos, knelt beside her, smoothing Emma's dark curls and whispering gentle reassurances in both English and Spanish. "Mia, you just tell them what you saw, okay? Tell them the truth, and everything will be fine," Maria said, though her own voice betrayed the anxiety she felt about putting such a young child through this ordeal. The victim's advocate, Jennifer Walsh, approached them with a warm smile that didn't quite mask her concern about Emma's readiness to testify. Inside the courtroom, the defendant Robert Klein sat at the defense table, his leg bouncing nervously under the polished wood surface. His public defender, Lisa Martinez, no relation to the young witness, reviewed her notes one final time, knowing that her client's fate likely rested on whatever this traumatized child might say. Klein had maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest, claiming he was being set up, but his criminal record made his protestations ring hollow to most ears. The real surprise in the courtroom, however, was the presence of Officer Jake Anderson and his canine partner, Rex, a magnificent German shepherd whose dark coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Rex sat with military precision beside his handler, his intelligent brown eyes scanning the room with the alertness that had made him one of the most celebrated police dogs in the LAPD. Officer Anderson, a 15-year veteran with commendations, covering his uniform jacket, was there to testify about the arrest and the crucial evidence Rex had helped gather at the scene. What no one in that courtroom knew was that Emma Martinez had been watching Rex with growing agitation since the moment they had entered. Her small body had begun trembling, and her breathing had become shallow and rapid, signs that Maria Santos recognized as the onset of one of Emma's panic episodes. But this wasn't the usual trauma response they had learned to manage. This was something else entirely. Something that seemed to be building toward an explosion of some kind. Judge Stone called the court to order, her gavel echoing through the suddenly silent room. The State of California versus Robert Klein. We are here for the continuation of testimony in this armed robbery case. She turned her attention to the prosecution table. "Mr. Hayes, please call your next witness." District Attorney Hayes stood with the confidence of a man who had built his reputation on putting dangerous criminals behind bars. His silver hair and expensive suit commanded respect, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had never lost a high-profile case. "Your Honor, the state calls Emma Martinez to the stand." The courtroom held its collective breath as the 7-year-old witness was led to the stand. Her small frame was dwarfed by the imposing witness chair, and court staff had to adjust the microphone significantly to accommodate her height. Judge Stone's expression softened as she looked down at the child, her maternal instincts kicking in despite her professional demeanor. "Emma," Judge Stone said gently, "do you understand that you need to tell the truth today?" Emma nodded solemnly, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination that struck everyone present. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." As Emma settled into the witness chair, her gaze swept across the courtroom, taking in the sea of unfamiliar faces, the imposing wood paneling, and the American flag that hung majestically behind the judge's bench. But when her eyes landed on Rex, something extraordinary happened. The fear in her expression transformed into something else entirely recognition, followed by what could only be described as righteous anger. District Attorney Hayes approached. The witness stand with the gentle demeanor he reserved for child witnesses. "Emma, can you tell us what you saw on the night of March 15th? Emma opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes remained fixed on Rex, and her small hands gripped the arms of the witness chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The courtroom grew increasingly uncomfortable with the extended silence, and Judge Stone was about to intervene when Emma suddenly stood up in the witness chair. "That's him," she declared, her small voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Her tiny finger pointed directly at Rex, and the German shepherd's ears perked up at the attention. "That's the one who knows the truth." The reaction was instantaneous and electric. Spectators gasped and leaned forward in their seats. Robert. Klein's eyes widened in shock, and what might have been hope. Defense attorney Lisa Martinez felt her pulse quicken as she sensed an unexpected opportunity developing. Officer Anderson's face went pale, and his hand instinctively moved toward Rex's leash, though the well-trained dog hadn't moved a muscle. Judge Stone's gavel hit the bench 3 times in rapid succession. Order! Order in this courtroom! But, even as she called for quiet, her own mind was racing. In 25 years on the bench, she had never witnessed anything quite like this. Child witnesses were unpredictable, certainly, but this felt different. This felt significant. District. Attorney Hayes stood frozen at the prosecution table, his carefully prepared questions suddenly seeming irrelevant. His team of prosecutors exchanged worried glances, unsure of how to proceed. This wasn't in any of their preparation sessions with Emma. The child had been coached extensively on what to say about the robbery, but no one had anticipated this. Fixation on the police dog. Emma remained standing in the witness chair, her finger still pointing at Rex, her entire body trembling with an intensity that made Maria Santos start to rise from her seat in the gallery. The little girl's next words would change everything, though no one in that packed courtroom could have imagined just how dramatically their world was about to shift. The silence stretched on, pregnant with possibility and dread, as everyone waited to discover what secret this brave little girl was about to reveal. The morning sun had shifted, casting new shadows across the courtroom floor, and in that charged atmosphere, it felt as though justice itself was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to finally emerge from the mouth of a child who had seen far too much for her tender years. Word count, 1,000 words exactly. 3 months earlier, on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in March, 7-year-old Emma Martinez crouched behind Mrs. Patterson's prize-winning rosebush, her small body shaking from both the cold and the fear that had driven her from her foster home. The thorns scratched at her thin jacket, but she barely noticed the pain. It was nothing compared to the bruises hidden beneath her clothes, fresh reminders of her stepfather Miguel's latest drunken rage. The streetlights cast eerie shadows through the residential neighborhood of East Los Angeles, and Emma clutched her backpack, containing the few precious belongings she had managed to grab before fleeing through her bedroom window. She had nowhere to go. At 7 years old, the concept of calling police or social services seemed as foreign and terrifying as returning home to face Miguel's wrath. Her foster mother, Carmen, worked double shifts at the hospital and wouldn't return until after midnight. By then, Miguel's anger would have fermented into something even more dangerous. Emma had learned to read the signs, the particular way his jaw clenched, the heaviness in his breathing, the way his fists opened and closed when he'd been drinking. Tonight, those signs had screamed danger, and her survival instincts had kicked in with remarkable clarity for someone so young. The rain had stopped, but the air remained thick with moisture and the scent of wet asphalt. Emma's stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the school lunch 12 hours earlier. Her small body was growing numb from crouching in the same position, but she was afraid to move, afraid that any sound might draw unwanted attention. The neighborhood seemed deserted, except for the occasional car passing by, their headlights momentarily illuminating her hiding spot before disappearing into the night. Murphy's gas station sat across the street like a beacon of fluorescent light. In the darkness, Emma had been there countless times with Carmen to buy milk or bread, and Mr. Murphy, the elderly owner, always slipped her a free candy bar when Carmen wasn't looking. The familiar sight of the station provided a small comfort in her terrifying situation. Though she had no money to buy food, even if she dared to venture inside Dot, it was then that Emma noticed the unmarked police car parked in the shadows beside the station's air pump. At first, she felt a surge of relief. Police meant safety, protection from people like Miguel. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Officer Jake Anderson, still in uniform but clearly trying to remain inconspicuous, was standing beside the vehicle, having what appeared to be an intense conversation with a man Emma didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and wiry, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. But it was his body language that caught Emma's attention, the way he kept looking over his shoulder, the nervous energy in his movements, the way his hands gestured emphatically as he spoke. Emma's young mind, sharpened by a lifetime of reading dangerous situations for her own survival, recognized the signs of someone planning something bad. Rex, Officer Anderson's German Shepherd partner, sat calmly in the back seat of the police cruiser, his dark silhouette visible through the partially opened window. The dog's presence had always been reassuring to Emma during school visits by police officers, but tonight, something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire scene. Why was a police officer meeting secretly with a suspicious-looking man in the shadows of a gas station at nearly 11 o'clock at night? Emma watched in growing horror as Officer Anderson handed the stranger something. It looked like money or papers, though she couldn't be certain from her distance. The exchange was brief but clearly significant, and both men looked around nervously, as if ensuring they weren't being observed. Emma pressed herself deeper into the rose bushes, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain they would hear it. The stranger checked his watch, nodded to Officer Anderson, and began walking toward the gas station's entrance. Emma's confusion deepened as she watched Officer Anderson return to his patrol car and position it further back in the shadows, as if preparing to watch whatever was about to unfold. Rex remained calm and alert in the back seat, but there was something unsettling about the dog's demeanor. He wasn't exhibiting the excited behavior Emma had seen during school demonstrations when officers prepared for action. Minutes ticked by. With agonizing slowness, Emma's legs began to cramp from her prolonged crouch, but she didn't dare move. Something momentous was about to happen, and her instincts told her that her life might depend on remaining hidden and silent. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's gas station hummed quietly, casting harsh shadows that made the scene feel surreal and menacing. At exactly 11:17 p.m., Emma would remember the time because she kept glancing at the digital clock visible through the station's window. The stranger entered Murphy's gas station. Through the large plate glass windows, Emma could see Mr. Murphy behind the counter, probably reading one of his crossword puzzle books, as he always did during quiet evening hours. The elderly man looked up with a friendly smile as the stranger approached, completely unaware of the danger. Walking through his door. Emma watched in stunned disbelief as the stranger suddenly produced what appeared to be a weapon and pointed it at Mr. Murphy. The old man's hands flew up in surrender, his face a mask of terror and confusion. The robbery was happening exactly as planned. and Officer Anderson was making no move to intervene. Instead, he remained hidden in the shadows with Rex, watching the crime unfold as if it were a television show. The realization hit Emma like a physical blow. The police officer wasn't there to stop the robbery. He was part of it. She had stumbled onto something far more sinister than a simple crime. She was witnessing corruption at its most fundamental level, watching a sworn protector of the law collaborate with criminals for reasons she couldn't understand, but knew were terribly wrong. As the robbery continued inside the station, Emma felt a terror unlike anything she had ever experienced, even during Miguel's worst rages. This wasn't just about her personal safety anymore. This was about the shattering of everything she had been taught about right and wrong, about who could be trusted to protect innocent people like Mr. Murphy. The world had suddenly become its much more dangerous and unpredictable place, and Emma Martinez, at 7 years old, found herself the sole witness to a conspiracy that would haunt her for months to come. The days following that horrific night at Murphy's gas station passed in a blur of terror and sleepless paranoia for Emma Martinez. She had managed to sneak back into her foster home before Carmen returned from her hospital shift, slipping through the same bedroom window she'd escaped from hours earlier. Miguel was passed out on the living room couch, surrounded by empty beer bottles, completely unaware of his stepdaughter's midnight adventure. But Emma couldn't shake the images burned into her 7-year-old mind. Officer Anderson's secretive meeting with the robber, Rex sitting calmly as if this were routine, and the sickening realization that the people sworn to protect were actually predators in disguise. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came the next morning, when Emma saw the news coverage on the kitchen television. Reporter Sandra Martinez stood outside Murphy's gas station, her perfectly styled hair and professional demeanor a stark contrast to the crime scene tape fluttering behind her. Local hero Officer Jake Anderson and his K-9 partner Rex apprehended the suspect within minutes of the robbery, thanks to their quick response and Rex's exceptional tracking abilities, she announced with enthusiasm. Emma nearly choked on her cereal as she watched Officer Anderson being interviewed, Rex sitting obediently at his side while cameras captured every angle of their supposed heroism. Anderson's voice was smooth and confident as he described the pursuit and difficult arrest, painting himself as a dedicated officer who had risked his life to protect the community. The lies flowed so naturally from his mouth that Emma began to question her own memory. Had she really seen what she thought she had seen? But the doubt vanished when she noticed Officer Anderson's eyes during the interview. Even through the television screen, she could see the same cold calculation she had witnessed in the shadows beside the gas station. This was a man who had perfected the art of deception, and Emma realized with chilling clarity that if he discovered she had been watching that night, her life would be in mortal danger. Carmen Martinez, Emma's foster mother, noticed the change in her daughter immediately. The quiet, withdrawn child had become even more isolated, jumping at every sound and refusing to leave the house except for school. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, called to express concern about the little girl's increasingly erratic behavior. She would panic whenever police officers visited the school for safety presentations, and her artwork had taken on disturbing themes of dogs and uniformed figures that teachers found deeply troubling. "Mia, what's wrong with you lately?" Carmen asked one evening after Emma had refused to go to the corner store with her. "You used to love seeing Officer Martinez when he walked his beat through the neighborhood. Now you run and hide whenever you see a police car." Emma wanted desperately to tell Carmen everything, but the words seemed trapped in her throat by an overwhelming fear. How could she explain that the heroes everyone celebrated were actually criminals? Who would believe a 7-year-old foster child with a history of trauma over a decorated police officer? And more terrifyingly, what would happen if Officer Anderson learned that she was talking The breaking point came 2 weeks after the robbery when Emma saw Officer Anderson and Rex at the grocery store where Carmen worked as a part-time cashier. Anderson was off duty, wearing civilian clothes, but Emma recognized him instantly. When his eyes met hers across the produce section, she saw a flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or curiosity, that made her blood turn to ice. Had he seen her that night? Did he know she had witnessed his meeting with the robber? Rex, walking calmly beside his handler, suddenly turned his attention toward Emma. The German shepherd's intelligent eyes seemed to study her with an intensity that made her knees weak. Dogs were supposed to be friendly and protective, but Rex's gaze felt calculating and threatening. Emma grabbed Carmen's hand and whispered urgently that she needed to go to the bathroom. But what she really needed was to escape before Officer Anderson decided to approach them. That night, Emma's nightmares reached a new level of intensity. She dreamed of Rex chasing her through dark alleyways, while Officer Anderson laughed from somewhere in the shadows. She woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, and found Carmen sitting on the edge of her bed with worried eyes. "Baby girl, you're scaring me," Carmen whispered, stroking Emma's damp hair. "These nightmares are getting worse every night. Maybe we need to talk to Dr. Phillips again." Dr. Sarah Phillips was the child psychologist who had been working with Emma since she entered foster care. A kind woman in her 50s with gentle eyes and infinite patience. Dr. Phillips had helped Emma process the trauma of her biological parents' neglect and Miguel's abuse. But Emma had never told her about that night at the gas station, and she certainly couldn't tell her now, when she was beginning to suspect that adults couldn't be trusted to protect children from the very people who were supposed to keep them safe. During their sessions, Emma's drawings became increasingly dark and symbolic. She would sketch police dogs with bared teeth standing over fallen children, or uniformed figures with shadowed faces reaching toward small, frightened forms. Dr. Phillips recognized the signs of severe psychological trauma, but couldn't identify the source. Emma's responses to questions about police officers were particularly concerning. She would shut down completely, or sometimes become agitated to the point of panic attacks. "Emma, sweetie, has someone in uniform hurt you?" Dr. Phillips asked, during one particularly difficult session. "You know you can tell me anything, right? My job is to keep you safe." But Emma couldn't bring herself to speak the truth. The adult world had become a minefield of potential betrayal, and she had learned through bitter experience that the people who promised protection often turned out to be the most dangerous of all. If decorated police officers could be criminals, how could she trust a psychologist she had only known for a few months? The situation became even more complicated when Emma learned that an innocent man had been arrested for the robbery. Thomas Rodriguez, an unemployed father of 3 with no connection to the crime, was being held in jail while his family struggled to prove his innocence. Emma saw his wife and children interviewed on the local news, their faces etched with desperation and confusion as they pleaded for anyone with information to come forward. Emma's 7-year-old sense of justice warred with her terror of Officer Anderson. She knew she held the key to freeing an innocent man, but she also knew that speaking up might cost her life. The weight of this knowledge was crushing for someone so young, and she began to exhibit signs of severe depression that alarmed everyone. Around her, Carmen, desperate to help her foster daughter, scheduled additional therapy sessions and even considered enrolling Emma in a residential treatment program. But nothing seemed to penetrate the wall of fear and secrecy that Emma had built around herself. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own knowledge, too terrified to speak and too moral to remain completely silent. As the weeks passed and Thomas Rodriguez's trial date approached, Emma faced the most difficult decision of her young life. The innocent man's fate hung in the balance, while Officer Anderson continued his career as a celebrated hero, probably planning his next criminal enterprise. Emma Martinez, barely 7 years old, found herself carrying a burden that would have challenged the strongest adult, the responsibility of exposing corruption while protecting herself from the very people society trusted to serve and protect. Thomas Rodriguez sat in his orange jumpsuit on the narrow cot in cell block D of the Los Angeles County Jail, staring at the concrete wall where he had scratched 27 hash marks 1 for each day he had been imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. At 34 years old, Thomas had never imagined his life would take such a devastating turn. Just 3 months ago, he had been a hard-working construction foreman, supporting his wife Isabella and their 3 children, Miguel, age 10, Sophia, age 7, and baby Carmen, barely 18 months old. Now he was facing 15 to 20 years in state prison for armed robbery, watching his family's world crumble from behind steel bars. The evidence against Thomas seemed overwhelming, crafted with the precision of someone who understood exactly how to manipulate the justice system. His fingerprints had been found on the counter at Murphy's gas station, but Thomas had a perfectly innocent explanation for that. 2 days before the robbery, he had stopped at the station to buy diapers and formula for baby Carmen, paying with crumpled dollar bills he had earned from a small roofing job. Mr. Murphy himself had confirmed this during questioning, but the prosecution argued that this earlier visit had been reconnaissance for the planned robbery. More damning was the eyewitness testimony from Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the elderly woman whose rose garden had provided Emma Martinez with her hiding spot that terrible night. Mrs. Patterson, suffering from early-stage dementia that the defense wasn't aware of, claimed to have seen a man matching Thomas's description, fleeing from the direction of the gas station around the time of the robbery. What she had actually seen was Thomas returning home from his evening job at a restaurant kitchen. But her confused timeline and the prosecution's skillful questioning had transformed an innocent man's daily routine into evidence of guilt. The crown jewel of the prosecution's case was Officer Jake Anderson's testimony and the supposed evidence gathered by his canine partner, Rex. Anderson testified with the confidence of a 15-year veteran, describing in vivid detail how Rex had tracked the suspect's scent from the gas station directly to Thomas's neighborhood. The German Shepherd's reputation as an elite tracking dog made this testimony nearly unshakable. Who would question the nose of a police dog that had solved dozens of cases? What the jury didn't know was that Rex had never actually tracked anyone from the gas station that night. Instead, Officer Anderson had driven the dog to Thomas's neighborhood hours after the robbery, allowing Rex to pick up Thomas's scent from his daily walking route to and from work. Anderson then constructed an elaborate narrative about the pursuit and tracking, complete with fabricated evidence markers and detailed notes that painted a picture of thorough police work. Thomas's court-appointed attorney, Maria Santos, a overworked public defender handling 37 cases simultaneously, did her best with limited resources. But she was fighting an uphill battle against a well-oiled prosecution machine. Santos suspected something wasn't right about the case, but she lacked the time and resources to conduct the thorough investigation needed to uncover the truth. Her requests for additional expert witnesses to challenge the dog tracking evidence were denied due to budget constraints, and her attempts to discredit Mrs. Patterson's testimony were hampered by the woman's sympathetic presentation as a concerned elderly citizen. Meanwhile, Thomas's family was disintegrating under the crushing weight of his absence and the mounting legal bills. Isabella Rodriguez, a petite woman with calloused hands from her work as a hotel housekeeper, had taken on 2 additional part-time jobs cleaning offices at night and working weekends at a laundromat just to keep food on the table and pay for Thomas's legal defense. The stress was taking a visible toll on her health. She had lost 15 pounds and developed a persistent cough that she couldn't afford to have examined by a doctor. 10-year-old Miguel Rodriguez had become the man of the house overnight, helping his mother care for baby Carmen while trying to maintain his grades at school. The boy's teachers reported that his behavior had changed dramatically. He was aggressive with classmates, had difficulty concentrating, and often fell asleep in class from exhaustion. When other children asked about his father, Miguel would either lie and say Thomas was working out of town or get into fights that resulted in suspension. 7-year-old Sofia Rodriguez, coincidentally the same age as Emma Martinez, had developed severe anxiety and selective mutism. She would speak only to her immediate family and had regressed to bedwetting and clinging to her mother's leg whenever strangers appeared. The child psychologist at her school recommended immediate counseling, but Isabella couldn't afford private therapy, and the waiting list for county services stretched 6 months into the future. Baby Carmen, now walking and beginning to form words, would toddle around the small apartment looking for her father, pointing at his photograph and saying, "Dada?" with heartbreaking confusion. Isabella would hold her youngest daughter and try to explain, in simple words, that Daddy was away. But how do you tell an 18-month-old that their father might never come home? The financial devastation extended beyond just lost income. Thomas's arrest had cost him his job immediately, and his reputation in the tight-knit construction community was ruined. Even if he were eventually exonerated, the stigma of the arrest would follow him for years. Isabella had been forced to sell their small used car to pay for legal fees, making her daily commute to multiple jobs a nightmare of buses and long walks that consumed hours she desperately needed for sleep. The family's modest savings, account money they had been putting aside for Miguel's future college education, was emptied within the first month to cover bail, which had been set impossibly high at $200,000. Unable to raise the full amount, Thomas remained in jail while his family struggled to survive without their primary breadwinner. Thomas himself was fighting a battle against despair that threatened to consume him entirely. The other inmates treated him with suspicion. Armed robbery was considered a serious crime that marked him as potentially dangerous, even among criminals. He spent most of his time in protective isolation, reading letters from his children and trying to maintain hope that somehow, somewhere, the truth would emerge. His faith was being tested in ways he had never imagined possible. Thomas had grown up believing in the fundamental fairness of the American justice system, trusting that truth and innocence would ultimately prevail. Now he was learning the harsh reality that justice was often a luxury available only to those who could afford experienced attorneys, expert witnesses, and private investigators. The most heartbreaking moments came during visiting hours when Isabella would bring the children to see their father behind the thick plexiglass barrier. Baby Carmen would reach for Thomas through the glass, not understanding why Daddy couldn't pick her up. Sofia would curl up in her mother's lap and refuse to speak, while Miguel would try to be brave and report on school and household responsibilities with a maturity that no 10-year-old should be forced to develop. "I didn't do this, Isabella," Thomas would whisper into the phone, his voice cracking with emotion. "You know, I would never hurt anyone, never steal from an old man like Mr. Murphy. Someone is lying. Someone is setting me up, but I don't understand why." Isabella believed her husband completely, but belief wasn't enough to overcome fingerprint evidence and police dog tracking and eyewitness testimony. She watched helplessly as the prosecution built their case with methodical precision, each piece of evidence another nail in the coffin of their family's future. As Thomas's trial date approached, the Rodriguez family faced the terrifying possibility that an innocent man would spend the next 15 to 20 years in prison while the real criminals walked free. None of them could have imagined that their salvation lay in the testimony of a traumatized 7-year-old girl who was carrying her own terrible secret about that night at Murphy's gas station. The morning of June 15th dawned gray and overcast, matching the somber mood that had settled over courtroom 4B as Emma Martinez was escorted to the witness stand for what everyone believed would be routine testimony in the Thomas Rodriguez armed robbery trial. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled the gallery alongside family members, curious onlookers, and court officials who had heard whispers about the unusual nature of this case. The air conditioning hummed loudly, but it couldn't dispel the thick tension that seemed to press down on everyone present. Emma's small hands trembled as she climbed into the witness chair, her legs dangling several inches above the floor, despite the booster cushion that had been provided. She wore her best dress, a simple blue frock that Carmen had bought especially for this day, and her dark hair had been carefully braided with ribbons that were already beginning to wilt in the humid courtroom air. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and determination, swept across the room, taking in the sea of adult faces that were all focused intently on her small form. District Attorney David Hayes had spent hours preparing Emma for this moment, coaching her through gentle questions about what she had witnessed on the night of the robbery. The prosecution team was confident in their case. They had fingerprint evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the credible word of a decorated police officer and his highly trained canine partner. Emma's testimony was intended to be the final nail. In Thomas Rodriguez's coffin, the innocent voice of a child confirming what the adults already knew to be true. But as Emma settled into the witness chair and the court reporter prepared to record her words, something extraordinary began to happen. Her gaze, which had been darting nervously around the courtroom, suddenly locked onto Rex with laser-like intensity. The German Shepherd sat in perfect formation beside Officer Anderson at the prosecution table, his dark coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his intelligent brown eyes alert and professional, as always. The moment Emma's eyes met Rex's, her entire demeanor shifted in a way that sent ripples of unease through the courtroom. The fear that had been etched on her young features transformed into something much more complex: recognition, followed by what could only be described as moral outrage. Her small hands, which had been fidgeting with her dress, suddenly gripped the arms of the witness chair with startling intensity. "Emma," District Attorney Hayes began in his most gentle, reassuring tone, "can you tell us what you saw on the night of March 15th at Murphy's gas station?" But Emma wasn't listening to the prosecutor. Her entire focus remained fixed on Rex, and those watching closely could see her lips moving silently, as if she were having an internal conversation with herself. Dr. Sarah Phillips, Emma's psychologist, sat in the gallery with growing concern as she recognized the signs of a significant psychological breakthrough or breakdown unfolding before her eyes. Thomas Rodriguez, dressed in an ill-fitting borrowed suit that his wife had managed to secure from a local church, leaned forward in his chair at the defense table. Something in the little girl's demeanor gave him a flicker of hope that he hadn't felt since his arrest 3 months earlier. His defense attorney, Maria Santos, felt her pulse quicken as her instincts told her that whatever was about to happen would be crucial to her client's fate. Officer Jake Anderson, seated confidently at the prosecution table, initially appeared relaxed and professional. He had testified in hundreds of cases over his 15-year career, and the testimony of child witnesses was always unpredictable, but rarely threatening to solid police work. But as he noticed Emma's unwavering focus on Rex, a subtle change came over his expression. The confident smile faded slightly, replaced by a wariness that those who knew him well would have recognized as his alert cop mode kicking in. Judge Rebecca Stone, who had been preparing to guide Emma through the standard preliminary questions, found herself hesitating as she observed the extraordinary tension building in her courtroom. In 25 years on the bench, she had developed an instinct for moments when cases were about to take unexpected turns, and every fiber of her judicial experience was telling her that they were approaching such a moment now. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, becoming increasingly uncomfortable as everyone waited for Emma to respond to the prosecutor's question. Court reporters paused with their fingers poised over their keyboards. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, and even the typically stone-faced bailiffs found themselves holding their breath in anticipation. Then, without warning, Emma stood. Up in the witness chair. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that several people in the gallery gasped audibly. Judge Stone's hand moved instinctively toward her gavel, but she held back, sensing that interrupting this moment might derail something critically important. Emma's small frame seemed to grow larger as she stood, her chin raised with a courage that was remarkable for someone so young who had endured so much trauma. "That's him," Emma declared, her clear young voice cutting through the stunned silence like a knife through silk. Her small finger extended toward Rex with unwavering certainty, and the German shepherd's ears perked up at the attention, though he remained in perfect position as his training demanded. The courtroom erupted into a cacophony of confused whispers and gasps. District Attorney Hayes felt his carefully prepared case beginning to slip through his fingers like sand, though he didn't yet understand why. Defense Attorney Santos gripped her legal pad so tightly that her knuckles turned white, sensing opportunity, but not yet comprehending its scope. But Emma wasn't finished. The floodgates of 3 months of suppressed trauma and moral conflict had finally burst open, and the words poured out of her with the force of truth that had been too long contained. "That's the dog who knows the truth," she continued, her voice growing stronger and more resolute with each word. "He was there before it happened. He knew the robber was coming because the policeman told him. The silence that followed was deafening. It was as if the entire courtroom had collectively held its breath, unable to process the magnitude of what this 7-year-old child had just revealed. The implications of her words hit different people at different speeds. Some immediately grasped the explosive nature of her accusation, while others struggled to understand how a police dog could be complicit in a crime. Officer Anderson's face went through a series of rapid changes: confusion, alarm, and then a carefully controlled blankness that anyone trained in reading suspects would have recognized as the expression of someone whose carefully constructed lies were beginning to unravel. Rex, responding to the tension in his handler, shifted slightly in his position, his brown eyes moving between Emma and Officer Anderson with the intelligent awareness that had made him such an effective police dog. Judge Stone found her voice first, though it carried none of its usual commanding authority. "Emma," she said carefully, "what do you mean when you say the dog knows the truth? Can you explain what you saw that night?" Emma turned her gaze from Rex to Judge Stone, and in that moment, everyone in the courtroom could see the weight of terrible knowledge in her young eyes. She had carried this burden alone for 3 months, and now she was finally ready to share it with the world, regardless of the consequences. "I saw the policeman talking to the robber before it happened," Emma said, her words falling into the courtroom like bombs. "They planned it together. The dog wasn't chasing anybody. He was waiting for it to happen because they already knew." The explosion of sound that followed, gasps, shouts, the scraping of chairs as people leaned forward or stood up in shock, was unlike anything the courtroom had ever experienced. But through it all, Emma remained standing in the witness chair, her small hand still pointing at Rex, her voice carrying the unmistakable ring of absolute truth that only the innocent possess. The courtroom descended into absolute chaos as Emma's words echoed through the stunned silence. They planned it together. Judge Rebecca Stone's gavel struck the bench repeatedly, bang, bang, but the sound was nearly drowned out by the eruption of voices, gasps, and the scraping of chairs as reporters frantically scribbled notes and spectators craned their necks to get a better view of the small girl who had just detonated a bomb in the heart of the justice system. Officer Jake Anderson's carefully constructed facade cracked like ice under pressure. The confident smile that had carried him through 15 years of decorated service vanished, replaced by a pallor that made his uniform seem to hang loose on his suddenly diminished frame. His hands, which moments before had rested casually on the prosecution table, now gripped the edge so tightly that his knuckles turned bone white. Rex, sensing his handler's distress through the leash that connected them, shifted uneasily and let out a low whine, the first sound the perfectly trained police dog had made during the entire proceedings. "Order! Order in my courtroom." "Judge." Stone's voice cut through the pandemonium with the authority of a woman who had controlled unruly courtrooms for over 2 decades. The gavel struck the bench one final time, this blow carrying the weight of finality. "Everyone will remain seated and silent, or I will clear this courtroom immediately." District Attorney David Hayes felt his meticulously prepared case disintegrating in real time. 30 years of prosecutorial experience had taught him to read juries, to anticipate defense strategies, and to maintain composure under pressure, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. A 7-year-old child had just accused his star witness, a decorated police officer, of conspiracy to commit armed robbery. Hayes's mind raced through the implications. If Emma was telling the truth, his office had been complicit in framing an innocent man, defense attorney Maria Santos, who had spent sleepless nights trying to find holes in what seemed like an airtight case, suddenly saw the landscape of Thomas Rodriguez's defense shift dramatically. Her hands trembled as she reached for her legal pad, but her mind was crystal clear. This was the moment every defense attorney dreams of and simultaneously dreads. The truth emerges not through careful investigation or legal maneuvering, but through the unexpected testimony of a child, brave enough to speak what adults had covered up. Thomas Rodriguez, who had maintained his composure throughout months of imprisonment and public humiliation, felt tears streaming down his face as Emma continued her testimony. For the first time since his arrest, he allowed himself to believe that justice might actually prevail, that his children might not have to grow up visiting their father through prison glass, that his wife Isabella might not have to work herself into an early grave to support their family alone. Emma, still standing in the witness chair with her small finger pointing at Rex, began to speak again, her voice gaining strength with each word. The 3 months of suppressed terror and moral conflict had transformed into a river of truth that could no longer be contained. "I was hiding in the bush because my stepfather was drunk and angry," Emma said, her words carrying the simple honesty that only children possess. "I saw the policeman's car in the shadows by the gas station. He got out and talked to a man in dark clothes. They shook hands, and the policeman gave him something, maybe money or papers. Then the man went into the store and robbed Mr. Murphy while the policeman watched from his car." The courtroom hung on every word as Emma described the scene with vivid detail that no 7-year-old could have fabricated. She spoke about the timing, about Rex sitting calmly in the back of the police car instead of being agitated as he would be before a real pursuit, about how Officer Anderson had positioned his vehicle to watch the robbery unfold rather than to respond to it. Officer Anderson made his first critical mistake in that moment of crisis. Instead of maintaining his composure or consulting with an attorney, he stood abruptly from his chair, causing Rex to stand as well, the trained dog following his handler's lead automatically. "Your Honor, this child is clearly traumatized and confused," Anderson said, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. "She's been through terrible experiences, and she's obviously mixing up different events in her mind. I've served this community for 15 years with distinction, and I won't stand here and allow my reputation to be destroyed by the fantasies of a damaged child." The words were barely out of his mouth when he realized his catastrophic error. By attacking Emma's credibility based on her trauma history, he had revealed knowledge about her personal situation that hadn't been entered into evidence. How could He knew about her stepfather's abuse or her psychological state unless he had been investigating her or worse, monitoring her since that night at the gas station. Defense Attorney Santos was on her feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. How? Does Officer Anderson know details about my client's witness that haven't been presented in this courtroom? I move for an immediate investigation into whether this witness has been intimidated or surveilled. Judge Stone's expression hardened as she processed the implications of Anderson's outburst. Officer Anderson, please sit down immediately. You are not authorized to speak in this courtroom unless called as a witness. She turned to Emma, her voice softening. Emma, sweetie, are you telling us that you saw Officer Anderson talking to the man who robbed the gas station before the robbery happened? Emma nodded solemnly, her dark eyes never leaving Rex. Yes, ma'am. And Rex knew it was going to happen too, because he wasn't excited or scared like police dogs get on TV. He was just sitting there waiting, like it was normal. The psychological insight was devastating in its simplicity. Emma had unconsciously identified the most damning evidence of all Rex's behavior. Police dogs are trained to be alert and aggressive when pursuing suspects, but Rex had remained calm throughout the entire incident because he wasn't pursuing a criminal. He was participating in a planned performance. Internal Affairs Detective Carmen Valdez, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom, observing the proceedings as part of routine departmental oversight, quietly activated the digital recorder on her phone and began making notes. Anderson's knowledge of Emma's personal history, combined with the child's detailed testimony about pre-planning, was creating a picture of corruption that extended far beyond a single robbery. The unraveling continued as Emma, encouraged by the respectful attention she was receiving from Judge Stone, began to provide even more specific details. She described the exact time of the meeting, 11:17 p.m., according to the gas station's digital clock visible through the window. She described Officer Anderson's body language during the conversation with the robber, the nervous way both men had looked around to ensure they weren't being observed, and most damningly, the casual manner in which Anderson had positioned his patrol car after the meeting, as if settling in to watch a show rather than preparing for law enforcement action. Prosecutor Hayes, recognizing that his case was not just falling apart, but potentially exposing his office to charges of prosecutorial misconduct, requested an emergency sidebar with Judge Stone and Defense Attorney Santos. The whispered conversation at the judge's bench lasted several minutes, during which Emma remained standing in the witness chair, her eyes still focused on Rex with unwavering determination. When the attorneys returned to their tables, Judge Stone addressed the courtroom with the gravity befitting a moment that would be remembered as a watershed in the county's legal history. "This court is calling an immediate recess," Judge Stone announced. "Officer Anderson, you are directed to remain in this courthouse and make yourself available for questioning by Internal Affairs. Rex will be temporarily reassigned pending a full investigation. Mrs. Santos, please prepare motions for dismissal of all charges against your client. Mr. Hayes, I suggest your office begin immediate review of any other cases involving Officer Anderson's testimony." As the courtroom began to empty, Emma Martinez finally sat down in the witness chair, her small body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She had carried the weight of terrible knowledge for 3 months, and in the span of 15 minutes, she had toppled a conspiracy that might have sent an innocent man to prison for decades. The little girl who had hidden in terror behind Rosebush had found her voice and used it to speak truth to power with devastating effectiveness. The 48 hours following, Emma Martinez's explosive courtroom testimony unleashed a tsunami of investigation that swept through the Los Angeles Police Department like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Internal Affairs Detective Carmen Valdez, a 20-year veteran known for her relentless pursuit of corrupt officers, had commandeered Conference Room C at police headquarters, transforming it into a war room where boxes of evidence, surveillance footage, and witness statements covered every available surface. The walls were lined with timeline charts, photographs, and a growing web of connections that revealed the shocking scope of Officer Jake Anderson's criminal enterprise. The first domino to fall was Robert Klein, the actual robber who had been Anderson's partner in the Murphy's gas station heist. When detectives arrived at his apartment at 6 a.m. on Thursday morning, they found Klein in a state of panic, frantically packing a duffel bag while muttering about that little girl and how she had seen everything. Under interrogation, Klein's resistance crumbled within hours when faced with Emma's detailed testimony and the mounting evidence of conspiracy. Klein's confession opened the floodgates to a corruption scandal that reached far beyond a single robbery. Through tears of fear and desperation, he revealed that Officer Anderson had been orchestrating staged crimes for over 18 months, using his position and Rex's reputation to create false heroic narratives, while splitting the proceeds with carefully selected criminals. The scheme was diabolically simple. Anderson would provide inside information about vulnerable targets, coordinate timing to ensure he would be the responding officer, and then stage dramatic arrests that enhanced his reputation while the real criminals escaped with reduced sentences in exchange for their silence. The investigation team discovered that Anderson's bank accounts contained over $200,000 in unexplained deposits, money that forensic accountants quickly traced to a complex network of staged robberies, burglaries, and drug busts that had made Anderson one of the most celebrated officers in the LAPD's history. His apartment revealed meticulous records of his criminal operations, including photographs, target locations, and detailed notes about which criminals could be trusted to play their assigned roles in his elaborate performances. Rex, the innocent German Shepherd, who had unwittingly become the symbol of Anderson's false heroics, was immediately reassigned to Officer Maria Gonzalez, an honest veteran with an impeccable record. Veterinary examinations revealed that the loyal dog was in perfect health, but had been showing signs of stress that experts now attributed to the conflicting commands he had received during Anderson's staged operations. Rex's training had made him compliant with Anderson's instructions, but his natural instincts had been confused by situations that didn't match his learned patterns for legitimate police work. The ripple effects of Emma's testimony extended throughout the criminal justice system, like an earthquake exposing hidden fault lines. District Attorney David Hayes, facing the most serious crisis of his career, ordered immediate review of every case that had involved Anderson's testimony over the past 5 years. The review team, working around the clock, identified 47 cases where Anderson's evidence had been crucial to convictions, meaning dozens of potentially innocent people were serving prison sentences based on fabricated police work. Thomas Rodriguez, who had spent 127 days in jail for a crime he didn't commit, was released on Thursday evening amid a flurry of media coverage that portrayed him as both victim and symbol of systemic failure. The moment when he walked out of Los Angeles County Jail was captured by every major news outlet in the city. Isabella Rodriguez, who had been surviving on 3 hours of sleep and determination alone, collapsed into her husband's arms on the courthouse steps, while their 3 children clung to him, as if afraid he might disappear again. The Rodriguez family's reunion was both joyous and heartbreaking. 10-year-old Miguel, who had been forced to become the man of the house, broke down in his father's arms, finally allowing himself to cry after months of trying to be strong for his mother and siblings. 7-year-old Sophia, who had been selectively mute since her father's arrest, whispered "Daddy" for the first time in 4 months. Baby Carmen, now 18 months old and walking confidently, had to be reintroduced to the father she barely remembered. The legal machinery of justice, once set in motion by Emma's courage, moved with remarkable swiftness. Anderson was arrested on charges of conspiracy, fraud, perjury, and abuse of power under color of authority. The FBI, recognizing the federal implications of a police corruption case involving civil rights violations, assumed jurisdiction and assigned a task force of 12 agents to uncover the full extent of Anderson's criminal network. Mayor Patricia Williams, facing intense public scrutiny and calls for her resignation, held a press conference where she announced the creation of an independent oversight commission to investigate police corruption and implement reforms designed to prevent future scandals. The courage of one 7-year-old child has exposed failures in our system that we can no longer ignore, Williams declared, her voice heavy with the weight of institutional accountability. Emma Martinez, the small girl whose testimony had toppled this house of cards, was placed under protective custody while the FBI investigated potential threats to her safety. The witness protection protocols were implemented not out of paranoia, but from the very real concern that Anderson's criminal network might include other corrupt officials who would view Emma as a threat to their own freedom. Dr. Sarah Phillips, Emma's psychologist, reported remarkable changes in her young patient's mental state following her courtroom testimony. Emma has experienced what we call post-traumatic growth, Dr. Phillips explained to Carmen Santos during one of their sessions. By finding the courage to speak her truth, she has transformed her trauma into empowerment. Her nightmares have decreased significantly, and she's beginning to trust authority figures again, now that she's seen justice actually work. The media attention surrounding the case was unprecedented, with Emma being hailed as a hero by editorial boards across the nation. The Los Angeles Times ran a front-page story titled, "The Courage of a Child," while CNN featured a segment on how Emma's testimony had exposed one of the largest police corruption scandals in recent California history. However, Emma's legal team, led by victims advocate Jennifer Walsh, carefully managed her exposure to protect her from the psychological pressure of sudden fame. Robert Klein, facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison, continued to cooperate with investigators in hopes of receiving a reduced sentence. His detailed confessions led to the arrests of 3 additional LAPD officers and 5 civilians who had participated in Anderson's staged crime network. Each arrest yielded new evidence and new confessions, creating a cascade effect that threatened to expose corruption reaching into the highest levels of the department. The most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered that Anderson's supervisor, Sergeant Michael Torres, had been aware of suspicious patterns in Anderson's arrest statistics, but had chosen to ignore them because Anderson's high-profile successes had brought positive attention to their division. Torres was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, while his own cases came under scrutiny for potential cover-up charges. As the week drew to a close, the city of Los Angeles found itself grappling with fundamental questions about police accountability, the reliability of criminal justice, and the power of individual courage to challenge institutional corruption. Emma Martinez, who had begun the week as a frightened child carrying a terrible secret, had become the catalyst for the most comprehensive police reform movement in the city's history. The innocent man was free, the guilty were being held accountable, and a 7-year-old girl had proven that truth, no matter how small its voice, could topple the mightiest walls of deception when spoken with courage and moral clarity. 6 months after that transformative morning in courtroom 4B, Emma Martinez stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel, her small frame dwarfed by the massive American flag backdrop and the sea of faces stretching out. Before her, the Governor's Award for Courage ceremony had drawn dignitaries from across the state, senators, judges, police chiefs, and civil rights leaders, all gathered to honor a 7-year-old girl whose willingness to speak truth had fundamentally changed the landscape of criminal justice in California. Emma wore a simple white dress with a blue sash that her foster mother Carmen Santos had helped her choose. her dark hair styled with the same careful attention that Carmen had given to every detail of this momentous day. But it was Emma's eyes that captivated the audience, no longer the frightened, haunted gaze of a traumatized child, but the clear, confident expression of someone who had discovered her own power to change the world. Governor Michelle Roberts, a former prosecutor herself, had insisted on presenting the award personally. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying across the packed ballroom, "we gather today not just to honor courage, but to celebrate the fundamental principle, the truth, no matter how young its voice, can triumph over the most powerful forces of corruption and deception." The investigation that Emma's testimony had triggered had grown into the largest police corruption scandal in California's history. Operation Clean Sweep, as the FBI task force had dubbed it, had resulted in 43 arrests, including 12 LAPD officers, 5 supervisors, and 26 civilians who had participated in Jake Anderson's elaborate criminal network. Anderson himself had been sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. His decorated career transformed into a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of unchecked power. Rex, the German shepherd who had unwittingly become a symbol of both corruption and redemption, sat proudly beside Emma on the stage. The loyal dog, now partnered with Officer Maria Gonzalez, had been retrained and was serving with distinction in legitimate police work. His presence at the ceremony was Emma's personal request. She had insisted that Rex deserved recognition as an innocent victim of Anderson's crimes rather than condemnation as a participant. Thomas Rodriguez, seated in the front row with his family, had tears streaming down his face as he watched the little girl who had saved his life receive the recognition she deserved. The wrongfully imprisoned father had become a powerful advocate for criminal justice reform, using his experience to highlight the human cost of corruption and the critical importance of protecting whistleblowers, regardless of their age. His family had received a $2.8 million settlement from the city of Los Angeles, money that would secure his children's education and compensate for the trauma they had endured during his incarceration. The Rodriguez family's recovery had been remarkable, but not without challenges. Isabella had quit her multiple jobs and returned to nursing school, pursuing the career she had abandoned when Miguel was born. 10-year-old Miguel, who had carried the burden of premature adulthood during his father's imprisonment, was receiving counseling to help him rediscover his childhood while maintaining the strength and resilience he had developed. 7-year-old Sophia had gradually emerged from her selective mutism, though she remained close to Emma, viewing her as a sister in courage, who had saved their family. The systemic changes triggered by Emma's testimony extended far beyond individual prosecutions. The Los Angeles Police Department had implemented the Martinez Protocols, named in Emma's honor, requiring independent oversight of all K-9 unit operations, mandatory body cameras for all officers, and psychological evaluations designed to identify officers who might be susceptible to corruption. Police academies across California had incorporated Emma's story into their ethics training, using her courage as an example of how moral clarity could emerge from the most unexpected sources. Dr. Sarah Phillips, Emma's psychologist, had documented her patient's transformation in what would become a groundbreaking study on post-traumatic growth in child witnesses. Emma's case challenges everything we thought we knew about childhood resilience, Dr. Phillips explained during her presentation to the American Psychological Association. She has demonstrated that children, when supported and believed, can not only survive trauma, but transform it into a force for positive social change. Emma's own journey from victim to hero had not been without setbacks. The media attention, while generally positive, had been overwhelming for someone so young. Carmen Santos and the victim advocacy team had worked tirelessly to protect Emma's privacy while allowing her story to inspire others. They had established strict boundaries around interviews and public appearances, ensuring that Emma's recovery remained the top priority, even as her courage inspired a national conversation about police accountability. The ripple effects of Emma's testimony continued to expand in ways no one had anticipated. The Emma Martinez Foundation, established with donations from across the country, provided support for child witnesses in criminal cases, funding therapy, legal advocacy, and educational programs designed to help young people navigate the complex world of criminal justice. The foundation had already assisted 47 children in cases involving police misconduct, giving them the resources and support that Emma had needed during her darkest moments. Standing at the podium, Emma looked out at the audience with the composure of someone far beyond her 7 years. Her speech, written with Carmen's help, but delivered in her own words, was simple yet profound. I was scared to tell the truth because I thought the bad people were stronger than the good people. But I learned that when you tell the truth, even if your voice is small, good people will listen and help you make things right. The audience rose in thunderous applause, but Emma wasn't finished. Rex and I want other kids to know that if they see something wrong, they should tell a grown-up they trust. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, but there are always good grown-ups who will listen and help. As the ceremony concluded, Emma was surrounded by well-wishers, fellow honorees, and dignitaries who wanted to thank her personally. But the moment that meant the most came when Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the elderly woman whose confused testimony had initially helped convict Thomas Rodriguez, approached Emma with tears in her eyes. "Sweetheart," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I'm so sorry I got confused and said the wrong things. Thank you for being brave enough to tell the real truth when I couldn't." Emma, displaying the wisdom and compassion that had emerged from her ordeal, took Mrs. Patterson's weathered hand in her small ones. "It's okay," Emma said simply. "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is that the truth came out in the end." As the evening wound down, Emma sat quietly with Rex in the hotel's garden, away from the crowds and cameras. Carmen Santos watched from a distance as her foster daughter, now officially her adopted daughter, following the completion of legal proceedings, gently stroked the German shepherd's fur while whispering secrets that only they would ever know. The little girl who had once hidden in terror behind rose bushes had blossomed into a symbol of hope and courage for millions of people around the world. Her story had been translated into dozens of languages, inspiring children and adults alike to speak up against injustice regardless of the personal cost. Emma Martinez had proven that heroism comes in all sizes. That truth has a power greater than any institution, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. As they prepared to return home to their new life, built on truth, justice, and the unshakable bond between a mother and daughter who had survived the darkness together, Emma looked up at Carmen with eyes that sparkled with hope for the future. "Mom," Emma said, using the word that still made Carmen's heart skip with joy, "I think I want to be a lawyer when I grow up. I want to help other kids tell their truth too." Carmen smiled, knowing that whatever Emma chose to become, she would approach it with the same courage and moral clarity that had already changed the world. The hero's journey was just beginning.